wherever I was going, wherever my husband and I would be going of an evening, he seemed to be there already. He'd know where we were going.
She was absolutely mentally raped and tortured on a daily basis.
Tracey went through, real horrendous sort of levels of stalking.
I think what Tracey went through would have killed other people.
I liken it to walking along the edge of a cliff, not knowing if today will be the day someone pushes you over.
Stalkers wear different faces. Some fantasize that their victims feel love for their tormentors. Others know they're feared, hated, avoided at all costs, but still pursue their obsession. They continue to make the lives of those they prey on utter misery.
Stalking has such a massive impact on the victims because it's chronic. Most crimes, being mugged, being burgled, are acute, but they're over pretty quickly. But the torture of stalking goes on for years and years and years. Stalking never goes away, absolutely never goes away. You don't know where the stalker is, what they're going to do next.
Stalking is one of the most common violent crimes, and yet until 1997 there was no law against it. Criminologists have proved that 1 in 4 women will be stalked during their lifetimes. That's 5 million women aged between 16 and 60 in Britain alone. Men too suffer stalking. 750,000 British men will be harassed this year. Some types of stalking can be relatively harmless: heartbroken ex-boyfriends, unwanted acquaintances. Others can render victims too afraid to leave their homes. And some can lead to murder.
Stalking is a type of harassment behaviour, but there are many types of harassment. Harassment by text messages, harassment by turning up, harassment by going to the pub knowing that your ex-partner will be there with their new partner and just standing there and staring. Lots and lots of different ways of harassing victims. And we have seen many cases in the UK where often young women have lost their lives at the hands of their offender, who perhaps very quickly escalated from compulsive jealous behaviour through to violent conduct and murderous behaviour. Stalking and harassment, you never know where it's going.
Too often, stalking ends in victims being killed. Claire Bernal, a beautician, worked in the famous Harvey Nichols store in London, where she met the security guard stalker who was to eventually kill her. Her murderer had been warned by the courts not to go near Claire after his threatening behaviour, but he was released on bail. He used the time to buy the gun with which to shoot Claire dead, and then he killed himself. Whilst Claire's killer knew her for a short time, other stalkers haunt their prey, morning, noon and night, for months, sometimes years. Another stalking victim, Tanya Moore, was 26 when her former fiancé, who'd harassed her for a year, ran her off this road before shooting her at point-blank range. Tanya, like Claire, was the classic stalking victim: confident, young, self-assured.
The most typical victim is somebody in their late 20s, early 30s, very, very attractive, with a good job, probably a nice car. It's somebody that has the kind of glamorous ideals, somebody that we all want to be, really.
Tanya's plight at the hands of her ex-partner was already known to police. His menacing behaviour had escalated over the months.
She's been suffering some mixed level of harassment, ranging from unwanted text messages to more robust threats going back a few months.
In fact, Tanya's killer, Mark Dyke, had sent hundreds of abusive texts, mounted a campaign of threats and intimidation, and had ignored a court order to keep the peace. Indeed, he had a history of violently stalking women. He'd threatened his first wife at knife point. Everyone knew that Dyke was dangerous, but still he was allowed the freedom to stalk and eventually kill Tanya. Killer stalkers escalate their behaviour, cranking up the levels of threats and contents of calls and letters. This woman faced 9 years of abuse at the hands of her stalker, with little the law could do to stop him. When a subsequent stalking law was introduced, it could not stop Stephen Griffiths murdering his victim, who pleaded by phone for the police to help her. Rana Faruqi had spotted Griffiths surreptitiously photographing her, rummaging through her bins, following her wherever she went. Eventually, he stabbed her to death. Stalkers can and do kill. The increasingly threatening pattern of behaviour which led to the deaths of Claire, Tanya and Rana is all too familiar to Tracey Morgan, whose 9-year ordeal at the hands of a stalker saw her fearing for her life every day. Tracey was young, confident, self-assured, the classic profile of a stalking victim who worked in Hampshire for the Royal Navy. In 1993, she was a personal assistant with ambitions to become a welfare officer. She thought she'd be good at helping people. She knew Anthony Burstow, a Royal Navy colleague, who looked like he needed a friend.
I worked in the general office. All the lads used to come in and have a chat, and this person was a loner, depressive, felt very sorry for himself, and I felt sorry for him. I wanted to be a welfare officer, wanted to help people, and thought I was doing him a favour when I was actually saying, do you want to come into Fareham over lunchtime for a coffee or a wander around the shops? And he came out with myself and my husband on a couple of occasions.
Burstow was married to a woman who also worked for the Navy. She was often stationed abroad. They were drifting apart and eventually separated.
I was the only female in the department. I was the only one that really talked to him because he was this loner. He'd say, I've got no friends in the area. I'd say, go home, get the house ready for Tracey coming home, because his wife was also called Tracey. And try and encourage him to do things, thinking I was helping, but actually, I just became his hobby.
At this point, even though Burstow's behaviour was slightly intense, there was no reason to suspect anything other than a classic work-based friendship. Colleagues who could complain about the same bosses, compare holiday plans.
Then I started seeing him wherever I was going of an evening, aerobics or evening classes. First of all, it didn't bother me, I wave or whatever. Then it began to get regular, and I started thinking, well, he's actually said he doesn't have any friends in the area, no interest, so what is he doing regularly in the middle of a housing estate when I'm picking up another colleague's wife to go to aerobics? And it began to worry me, but just put it to the back of my mind, don't be silly.
But she wasn't being silly. Anthony Burstow's behaviour escalated. It became more and more menacing.
I began to see him in my rearview mirror, regularly, going to and from work. He was following me, watching me, and wherever I was going, wherever my husband and I would be going of an evening, he seemed to be there already. He'd know where we were going. I would be in the house and I'd keep all the curtains shut and be terrified to go outside the door. I was on sleeping pills, thinking I was going mad.
Burstow was gathering intelligence, learning everything he could about Tracey, toying with her, the classic profile of a so-called sadistic stalker.
When he was actually following me that I knew about, it was driving to and from work. He'd always managed to park next to me at work. If I was going out of an evening, say to aerobics, I would pick another colleague's wife up, and he'd just happen to be driving by the end of the road or parked. At aerobics, driving by. I used to go to evening classes at Fareham College. He would just be driving by or parked in the car park. It just began to get regular. And to me, that's no coincidence. But at the time, with this type of behaviour, you just try and rationalise the irrational. You think, don't be stupid, you're just being paranoid. Pull yourself together.
Tracey continued for weeks to pull herself together, despite Burstow's constant unwelcome attention.
I used to see him going to lunch half an hour earlier from everybody else, and I used to think, I wonder where you're going. And it was at that point, sort of late November, December time, I think it was, that I would go home and things would be moved at home. Small things had been removed from the house. An example is when I went to take my contraceptive pill one night, the last 3 in the packet were missing. Now, how do you rationalise that? Am I overdosing on them? Am I taking them in my sleep? What's going on? I didn't feel I could go to the police at that point or the naval authorities and say what was happening, because how do you explain that? They would have had me sectioned.
Tracey and her husband of just a few years, Andrew, now felt utterly besieged by Burstow. They were keen to handle the problem themselves, not to worry other members of the family, like Tracey's mum. But at special occasions like her sister Louise's birthday, telltale signs began to appear.
They started to sort of tell a few little white lies what was happening, and then I thought, well, that's very strange. The first one that really came to point was when it was Louise's birthday and they were coming up for dinner and they didn't arrive, and Andy said that Tracey had gone out to buy a present for Louise and they'd be up later, but for us to go ahead with the dinner straight away. And I thought, well, that's not like them. They always were so much a family, and they would always come for a special occasion.
By now, Burstow's behaviour was distressing Tracey even more. He would phone the house at all times of the night or day. He would post cards through the letterbox just to make sure Tracey knew he was around. The top psychologist advising police forces and the Home Office today about stalking is Lorraine Sheridan.
Well, she was quarry and prey to him. He just wanted to dangle her, to make her feel uncertain. And so in that way then he could feel powerful. He was controlling her. He was kind of like a puppet master. And he wanted to just shake her belief in every aspect of the world. And this is the real thing that stalkers can do. They absolutely undermine somebody's belief in a happy, safe world, completely control them, destroy their life, make them feel utterly alone and helpless, whilst basically waltzing around free of police intervention.
Burstow was free from police intervention because with no stalking law in place, they could do little to protect people like Tracey. In fact, getting prompt action from police can be difficult for a number of reasons.
Quite often, we often see police officers who just can't quite believe what they're being told. And without any real clear evidence of what's gone on, and sometimes, Tracey will know that someone's been in the house, she'll know that things have been moved around, and other stalkers act in a similar way. But convincing a police officer that a crime is being committed or a real offence has been committed has been one of the big challenges.
With little help available from the police or her bosses, Tracey was persuaded finally to tell her family.
She didn't tell us all what was going on. She kept it secret from us, trying to hide it. And she hid it as long as she could, and then apparently one of the policemen said, "You've got to tell your parents."
Of course, immediately then, I thought, I knew there was something, what can I do to protect her? What can I do? Can I take it away? But I found that very hard because, like Brian, once we knew, he found it very difficult to cope with.
Couldn't believe it, really. Could not believe anybody would make anybody's life so bloody miserable. Unbelievable.
Weeks of 24-hour-a-day unwanted attention did seem unbelievable, and Tracey was convinced that Burstow was breaking into her house. To her complete bewilderment, he continued to know where she would be going all of the time. He would see her at work and then appear mysteriously wherever she went in the evening. Did he have some sort of sixth sense?
Everywhere we would go, he would be there already. And I used to scream at the walls, telling him to go away. Why was I losing it? And why? How come he knew so much? I remember going into my bosses at one point and saying, could he have bugged my house? And I was virtually laughed out the office. And I thought, Tracey, you've really lost it now. Get a grip. You are being stupid.
Tracey's innocent coffee and chat had been just 3 months earlier, but her life was now totally changed. Followed, badgered and bothered by a man she barely knew, she even feared that her stalker had surrounded her with listening devices. Could he have bugged where she worked and lived? Worse, would Burstow's escalating behaviour, the textbook actions of a potential killer, put Tracey's life in danger? Stalking is the most common so-called crime of intimate violence. There are several different categories of stalking. Perhaps the most well-known involves the celebrity stalker, whose victims include Uma Thurman. Jack Jordan claimed to be a harmless eccentric, but he bombarded the actress with letters, emails and calls and dogged her steps throughout New York. The former tennis star Monica Seles was followed all over the world by her stalker until he managed to stab her at a tournament. What starts innocently can often escalate to violence.
Once a stalker has been violent once, they'll continue to be violent. And it's the violent stalkers we need to find. It's the violent stalkers that we need information and intelligence on, because they're the people we need to stop before they do real harm to their victims.
The classic stalking victim is a seemingly successful woman in her 20s. The textbook sadistic stalker, those who toy with their victims and escalate their menacing behaviour, are the most dangerous, the potential killers. Anthony Burstow was toying with Tracey Morgan, and his behaviour was relentlessly escalating. Was he a sadistic, violent stalker about to attack?
Just after 3 months, having been followed, having been watched, we had silent phone calls daily, unsigned cards came through the post, monitored our every move. I was just a complete physical and emotional wreck.
Incredibly, in the early 90s, nothing Burstow was doing was against the law. He'd popped cards and envelopes through her door. Many of them had nothing written on them. That was not against the law. He'd track her movements and stare at her from across the street. That was also not breaking the law. And he would follow her in his car. But driving in the same direction, on the same road, and at the same time as someone is also not against the law. The police were powerless to act.
At that point in the January, the Navy actually realised that they couldn't deal with it and called in the police. But I was very lucky, extremely lucky, because the 2 police officers who knocked on my door believed me from day one. They took me seriously, and they actually fought with me to try and stop this behaviour. Yet they realised there was nothing in the law to stop what this man was doing.
The reality of Tracey's position with both the police and Burstow's employers unable to stop him was to get worse. Tracey had become convinced that Burstow had resorted to placing bugging devices where she worked or lived, or both. She thought she was going mad. It couldn't be true. But Anthony Burstow was a loner who worked in the Royal Navy Communications Division. If anybody could bug her house, it was him. She was not to discover until years later, but her worst fears were true.
Sadly, his profession in the Navy was a communications expert, so he knew what he was doing, and he'd actually placed listening devices in my sofa and bed and the office at work, so he was actually listening to everything that was going on.
A bug near Tracey's desk picked up her conversation with work colleagues. At home, microphones in her sofa and on or near her bed meant that everything she and her husband discussed, and did, was being listened to by Burstow. He literally was playing with her mind.
Because he'd bugged her, he had huge control over her life. It seemed sometimes that he knew what Tracey was doing before she even did, because he'd booked her and carefully considered all the conversations that she had. He knew exactly where she was going to be and what she was going to do, and so he could plan and be there first.
Burstow would be waiting at the dry cleaners or on the high street where Tracey shopped. He could even turn up at the surgery ahead of a doctor's appointment.
If I'd seen a figure down the end of an alleyway at midnight, I'd know it was him. I'd know by the way he walked. I think I'm just so tuned in.
Despite her torture at the hands of Burstow, it was still difficult to get the police involved.
It had got to the point where I actually told him to go away, in stronger words.
What happened on that occasion?
It was in the November. He'd actually followed me home from work, and I sort of just happened to look out the window, and he was parked in our close where we lived. And as I went out there, he was sitting in his car, and he looked as if he had what looked like a mobile phone. I said, "What are you doing?" what's that? And he said, none of your business. So I actually said, I'm trying to be a friend to you. You're not being one to me. Just go away.
I think Burstow was incredibly dangerous. I think he never saw the impact that it was having upon Tracey. He didn't care about the impact he was having. He always looked for trumping the next type of behaviour. He looked to escalate it beyond all expectation, and he was very successful at that.
It's the hardest thing. I don't think I've actually dealt with it, is the bugging, because what he must have listened to was the most intimate things. General chit-chat, where we were going. There was one point where we went to a local restaurant for a meal, and it's in his diary that where we were going, and that he went in, watched our wedding video, and ate this treacle tart that had gone missing. Because there are no physical injuries, what was the problem? Just pull yourself together is, the message that came to me. Yet actually, how much more of an invasion of privacy is that? It is mental rape.
Despite her torture at the hands of Burstow, it was still difficult to get the police involved.
Who's really going to take seriously somebody that turns up in a police station and say, I think somebody sneaked into my house, I have no evidence of this, and they have eaten a cake and read something, one of my letters in my drawer. I mean, people are going to look at you as if you're absolutely crackers. Nobody's going to believe that. And even if people do believe that, oh, so what? We've got 5 unsolved murders. We've got some sex offenders walking the streets out there, 2 streets away from the police station, and somebody's moaning because somebody's eaten a cake out of their cupboard. Oh, welcome to the world, love.
Tracey's story had reached the press, but still Burstow carried on with his stalking torture. He was seemingly oblivious to media exposure, to disciplinary action at work, and immune to prosecution.
As soon as he's told not to do something, he will do it just to prove he can. And the shift became not being obsessed with me, but being obsessed with the cat and mouse game through me. So I will do this if I want to because I can, and the shift became against the legal system then.
And Burstow set himself yet another challenge. He escalated his attacks to Tracey's family.
He actually researched my family tree, my husband's family tree, and on birthdays and anniversaries, my parents and my sister would get their original copies of their birth and marriage certificates.
I was at work one day and there were so many things I could do, and I didn't. I went over the shop over the road and I walked past this man and I thought, I know you, but I don't know how. And I got in the shop and then it dawned on me who he was. And that's when I thought, oh my God, he's here. What do I do now? How do I walk past him? What do I do? So I went back to work and immediately phoned home, phoned Trace, phoned Mum, and that's when that's when I realised he was then following the family. It wasn't just Trace.
I worked in the post room of a construction company in Bracknell, and he used to follow me, unbeknown to me. When he first came up, he followed everybody, but he followed me. And he was caught in the car park. Well, he wasn't caught, he was questioned in the car park because he was filming the car I was using. And he told the person that questioned him that he was from an accident repair company or something, the car had been in an accident.
One day we got up one morning and the garden was very colourful of condoms all over the garden. They'd actually been taken out of the packets and drooped all over the leaves in the garden. You don't expect that sort of thing, and you think, well, what behaviour is that of a person? Who would actually do that? What kind of human being would actually do that?
Targeting Tracey's mother, father and sister completed Tracey's torment. Her husband Andy would be on the end of many of the silent telephone calls. He'd received threatening mail. The couple had been married only a short time, but the strain caused by Burstow's behaviour was immense. Would their marriage survive? An innocent coffee and an idle chit-chat with a man from work had led to Tracey Morgan's life becoming a living hell. Wherever she went, he went. following her, tracking her every move, besieging her with letters and calls, and breaking into her home. In an exhausting campaign lasting over a year, he'd bugged her office and bedroom and stalked her parents and sister. Anthony Burstow's entire life was now just about stalking Tracey.
People could almost say make stalking almost their career, their professional criminal career, who know just how to wind people up, who'll be in the right place at the right time, to make those very simple and very strange little appearances which have such a dramatic psychological impact.
To some stalkers, such as Tracey's stalker, then this was their life's work. If you think about your own life, the amount of effort you put into your work, your family, your friends, supporting football, looking after dogs and cats, bringing up children, going to the supermarket, going to the pub, all the things you do, stalkers can put all that effort, absolutely all of that effort, just into stalking. It's only when we begin to think about stalkers in that way that we can realise what they're capable of, the amount of effort they put in, and of course they're going to want something back for that.
Some 18 months after Burstow's campaign had begun, he was finally sacked by the Royal Navy. However, the police seemed less able to help.
Tracey and I went for a walk and found him asleep in the car. And I banged on the car window and shouted at him to go away and leave us alone. And he just opened one eye and closed it and just laid there with his arms folded, completely motionless. And then we walked away and he got out of the car and went up into the woods. And we then surrounded the car and called the police. And we were told that we had to go home because we could be disturbing the peace. And before we even got home, he passed us in the car and drove past, and with a big grin on his face that we'd seen originally.
Burstow was brought before the courts constantly as police tried to stop him. He was bound over to keep the peace. However, the criminal justice system could do nothing.
There was no harassment, there was no stalking, the word didn't exist in those days. So they'd actually tried to get him on breach of the peace and little small minor crimes, not what he was actually doing. And it was very, very hard. The first time I went into court was for breaching a bind over, and I was in an absolute state. I'd had a call 8:30 in the morning to say you're required in court, never been inside a courtroom before, absolutely terrified, as well as having to face him. And by the time I'd gone in the courtroom, I was in an emotional state, and he got let off because of my nervousness in the witness box. And that was just the first of a catalogue over the years of examples of how I personally feel that the criminal justice system is weighted against the victim, very much for the perpetrator.
Burstow eventually did do something that allowed the police to level a more serious charge against him. He vandalised Tracey's car and was arrested for causing criminal damage. He received a prison sentence, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, Tracey and her husband felt they could relax. They were wrong.
In '93, he was jailed for pouring oil over my car, so criminal damage, and he was actually sentenced to 6 months. And we were going on holiday at that point to South Africa for a month, and we thought, thank goodness, he'd be locked up while we were away, because he'd threatened to burgle the house. He'd obviously listened to our plans, threatened to burgle the house while we were away. And we went out and had a fantastic holiday, came back, and the night we came back, the police came around and said, look, he's been released on appeal without us being informed the day after we left. We couldn't get warm in the house, and I went up to clean my teeth, and as I was cleaning my teeth, I turned the tap on and water started coming out over my feet, and the pipes had been loosened, and my husband checked downstairs, and we thought, okay, it could be just lack of use. And then he went to the lounge window, and there was no glass in there. It was November, so we had the curtains shut, and so that was a sort of disappointment. Again, criminal justice system, the way it treats its victims.
The police tried to make a more serious charge stick and began to push the legal boundaries, suggesting that though Burstow had not physically attacked Tracey, his behaviour amounted to grievous bodily harm. He deeply traumatised her, caused her psychiatric harm.
In the early days, Tracey really struggled to try and get someone to take her seriously. Once we did take her seriously, then Tracey was very well protected. But she couldn't be that protected because we didn't have the legislation in place.
Because it was a test case of psychiatric GBH, it was on the word inflict, I believe. And I think it was deemed that, it was my emotional state that was at fault. If I'd have been a harder person and ignored it, it would have been no problem.
There was actually a law against stalking in ancient Roman society, but we got our law in 1997.
Police officers weren't really aware of the risks around stalking. And I think what we've had to work really hard on in the last 10, 15 years in the UK is really to bring greater levels of awareness to police officers to understand the impact that stalking can have.
We'd only really seen victims getting justice when after they've been murdered, or after they've been raped, or after some other index offence, because stalking simply was not illegal.
Chillingly, to get justice, Tracey actually wanted to be attacked.
And I've spoken to many victims who've said the same. You get to the point where you think, just come and attack me, let's get it over with, because the psychological damage and the daily assault that goes through your mind, you're trying to survive the day instead of living it, because you don't know what will happen next. That's almost worse. You're just willing something to happen just to get it over with.
I've seen so many victims of offenders like this, and they absolutely want to be attacked by the offender. They absolutely want the bruises, they absolutely want to go into A&E, they want to go into the police station and say, look at my black eye, look at my broken arm, because finally then the victims can get something done about it, because everybody has to take a physical assault seriously.
Burstow's behaviour finally went so far that he was convicted of psychiatric grievous bodily harm. He'd signed undertakings to leave Tracey alone, accepting that he was making her suffer. By carrying on, he left himself open to another charge, and this time it stuck. But Tracey's torture was not over.
At one point, I had an envelope come out of Winchester Prison with coffins and crosses all over it and so many days to go. He would calculate judgment days, one of which was my birthday in '94. There was another one coming up, I don't know when, we never found that one out, but there's lots of Bible extracts.
With no end in sight to the suffering caused by Burstow, things grew to a head between Tracey and her husband Andy until eventually he snapped. Burstow, it seemed, was prepared to take matters further than anyone had imagined, and Andy had had enough.
In 1994, he actually left in the October. I think it was a combination of things. One is that we'd been told that Burstow, we had confirmation that he'd bugged our house, what we suspected, but obviously, things like this only happen in films, so it couldn't be true, but it was. The second was that Burstow had tried to take a contract out on him. He'd tried to pay someone to shoot my husband. And I think lastly, in that I was becoming a different person. He'd married this shy, quiet person who wouldn't say boo to a goose. But because of the fight needed, because I was learning things about the criminal justice system that I didn't like and was challenging it, I became someone with opinions, and he didn't really like that. He described a good analogy is that we've come through a long black tunnel but out of different exits. And so he left, and I had no option but to move back to the realm I grew up in and start again.
Tracey was permanently on sedatives by day and sleeping tablets by night. Even from prison, she was being stalked. Her marriage was over. She'd been forced from her home, and she'd seen her family stalked. Everything she had built had been taken. She had no option but to fight back. Despite the efforts of the police, Burstow, released on parole, was again free. Tracey Morgan had been stalked by Anthony Burstow for 3 years. Living now with her parents in a village called Crowthorne in Berkshire, She felt her life had been stolen.
And it was very hard. My friends were out there getting on with their lives, having babies, which is something, I'd wanted. And I was starting again, really.
But the move back to her family home was to give an opportunity to Burstow to escalate his bizarre and menacing behaviour.
He actually moved his attention to Berkshire, to the village where I live, and suddenly, having had no previous connection with the county, was a regular in the village.
Nowhere was safe for Tracey. She and her parents tried everything to arm themselves against Burstow.
We had lights put in the garden so that we could see what was going on, and every time the lights went on, I think Brian and I were up at the window watching to see what was happening, to make sure that there was nobody out here.
We had support from the villagers as well. They were very good. They would spot him if we didn't. So when she came up here, she did get a lot of support.
I contacted Burstow's mother and asked if she would try and stop her son behaving in this way, and I wrote to her, and that had quite detrimental consequences, because he then saw that as a threat to his family, and he didn't like his family being involved, and that was a threat to his mother. For what reason I didn't understand at the time, and I felt that although he was a grown man, I had a grown daughter, but why wouldn't he leave my daughter alone?
Not even a mother-to-mother appeal was to stop Burstow. Indeed, just when Tracey and her family thought it could get no worse, it did.
When he was sort of starting playing games through me with the legal system of, if he was bound over not to come within 400 yards, he'd be within 401 yards. He tried to rent a house less than 500 yards away. During that period, it was a case of just trying to keep a grip on sanity. It was a case of not only dealing with the stalking, dealing with the not knowing if you're going to die today. Will I wake up in the middle of the night and the house will be alight? Will I step off the curb and a car will come at me? You just don't know what will happen next. Your adrenaline is pumping at 24/7. I liken it to walking along the edge of a cliff, not knowing if today will be the day someone pushes you over. You just have to be prepared every day, every night. You just don't know what will happen next, and that's the worst part.
It took a hideous attack by Burstow on another woman to end Tracey's torment. On his release from prison, Burstow had changed his name, eerily to that of one of Tracey's former boyfriends, and he had begun a relationship with a woman. In November 2000, he attacked the woman with a knife, nearly severing her hand. He was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to life. Burstow really was, for the first time in 9 years, out of Tracey's life, if not her mind.
She is a different person now, definitely, and like we all are. We don't take phone calls very easily. We don't open our mail straight away. The envelopes are turned over. Always suspicious of what's going on.
When she was a little girl, she wouldn't speak to anybody. Very shy, inward. Wouldn't speak, but being put through this brought her out, gave her more confidence. She knew she had to fight it. She knew she had to win.
Tracey had become emboldened by her experiences. She fought almost single-handedly to get a new law to protect people like her introduced. Her campaign paid off. Legislation aimed at preventing harassment was introduced.
Tracey's case and Tracey herself led to the introduction in this country of the Protection Against Harassment Act, and that provides the police and the authorities and victims with a greater degree of support and greater degree of protection than was ever available at the time that Tracey was being stalked. We now have an act, legislation, that we can use to tackle stalkers before their behaviour gets out of control.
As part of the laws against harassment, stalking is now defined as 2 or more incidents causing distress, fear or alarm of obscene or threatening unwanted letters or phone calls, waiting or loitering around home or workplace, following or watching or interfering with or damaging personal property by any person, including a partner or family member.
Basically, the object of stalking is the power game. It's control and power over the victim. And I think, had the law been in at the early stages of my case, I don't think we'd be talking today. I don't think there would be the history of my case. It's when stalkers are allowed to get away with what they're doing that they carry on, and then they build up their power, this feeling of power that they feel they can't stop then. So the object of the Protection from Harassment Act is to nip it in the bud.
The good thing about the Protection from Harassment Act in England and Wales is that it doesn't seek to define stalking. So in theory anyway, any 2 instances of any behaviour can constitute stalking under the Act. And of course, if you found somebody twice unwanted, that doesn't necessarily mean the police are going to come and arrest you. Not at all. But it gives police the opportunity to investigate any kind of intrusive behaviour.
Though the Act helps, Tracey still believes it does not go far enough.
The Harassment Act in itself is a powerful piece of legislation in that it has the restraining order attached. But I think the human rights of perpetrators far outweigh that of victims of crime still, even though there have been several initiatives. And I think it needs a sort of a sea change in attitude towards victims of crime and addressing the problems. We need prevention rather than sticking plasters on after the event.
The police are much better in this country than they used to be at dealing with stalkers. But we still have some victims, few and far between now, saying that I've spoken to 5 police officers and nobody's taken it seriously and nobody's joining up my complaints. I have to start again every single time. And so it's still a lot of luck in the draw, according to kind of which police station a victim walks into and which police officer they speak to. But in the huge majority of cases, we're seeing really, really, really good results from the police. We just need a little more joined up thinking and a little more in terms of risk assessment, because so many stalkers engage in such similar behaviour that it's very difficult to tell to the non-expert at the early stage which ones are going to go on to be more dangerous.
Tracey Morgan had been a meek and mild, shy woman, but had suffered nearly 10 years of torture at the hands of one man. She had grown strong enough to fight back and almost single-handedly was responsible for a change in the law. It's down to her that the police now feel they do have some powers to stop another Burstow.
Tracey Morgan's a very brave, courageous individual. She's been instrumental in bringing protection to victims of stalking and harassment in the United Kingdom. Without Tracey, we may not be in the position we're in today. Tracey works with me, she works with ACPO, she works with us to ensure that what she went through, no other victim should go through. She's ensuring that the right advice and the right knowledge and the right risk identification is being applied by police officers up and down the country. Tracey has brought that about. I'm very grateful for Tracey's commitment. Perhaps Tracey could have turned her back on the police and said they didn't look after me as well as they should have done, but she didn't. She recognises that most importantly is to protect victims, and Tracey's been brave enough to work with us to ensure that people do not lose their lives.
I think what Tracey went through would have killed other people. I absolutely believe that. The mental torture that she was forced to go through for so many years, and the fact that she's came out of it, and not only that, but she's helped so many other people and championed the cause of victims, makes her a pretty unique person.
I'm amazed and pleased that she got through it and survived. But for anybody to be put through that long, I think it's disastrous, really. Nobody should go through that long as well. You know, it's unbelievable.
However, as Tracey sits with her family, there's still a nagging fear. Burstow has now served enough of his sentence to be eligible for parole. The family almost expect him back.
It's very scary, but I do strongly believe that he wouldn't stay away. I think he will come back just out of curiosity. I don't necessarily know if he'll do anything, but he will come back just to see what's happening, see if mum and dad still live where they did live, you know, still see if everyone's still the same, see if things are still the same. I think curiosity will get the better of him. He has to come back and find out what's going on.
After Burstow was jailed for life, I had a breakdown and I spent a long time recovering, getting used to living life again, which I'm doing now. Living life, concentrating on the positives, but there is always, I think there always will be at the back of my mind, will this man be released? Will he try something from prison? He's actually tried to kill somebody, you know, what is going to stop him? You know, it's the unknown that is the fear factor, but I have to concentrate on the positives in life, otherwise he's won.